I just had to click the got it button. You probably got the same one coming up. Well, that was an introduction to live up to, Marty. So thank you very much. And thank you too to Friends of the Peter White Library for sponsoring these readings, the author virtual readings, as well as the Carol Paul Memorial Trust. And of course, thanks to you as an audience as well. So turning out on a cold winter night like this, that's really something. You look pretty cozy though. I'm going to read mostly poetry. There will be some prose, but mostly poetry this evening. I'll be blending some old poems and those with new poems, some published, some unpublished. But before I turn to the poems, a brief introduction. In 2012, back when it was easier to do foreign travel, my wife and I went to Rome for a week, and we did all the usual tourist things. We had to see the Colosseum, of course, and the Trevi Fountain and St. Peter's and Vatican City. But since we were both English majors in college, we also had to visit one of the less known shrines, and that is the small room overlooking the Spanish Steps where the poet John Keats died. Keats, his story in a way is the story of our own times when you think about it. He grew up in a London that was rife with diseases of all kinds, some of them brought from the colonies to London because of the imperial reach of England. So that included typhus, yellow fever, cholera, and tuberculosis. So these diseases were all swirling around in the streets of London. And that's at a time when Keats set out to become a physician. He studied medicine for 6 years, actually got a license to practice as an apothecary, a druggist. But increasingly, his attention turned to poetry, and he ended up being one of the major voices of the English Romantic movement. So poems like Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, The Eve of St. Agnes, those are all the poems that we associate with John Keats. One of the sad things about Keats is that his career ended so early. He died at the age of 25 of tuberculosis. First, a younger brother had died, and then when Keats realized that he was suffering from tuberculosis, he sought a cure by going to Rome, figuring that that would be a warmer climate. And that was one of the few things people could do back then. They really didn't know what caused tuberculosis. They really didn't know how to cure it. So basically people were two things. They were sent to warmer climates if that were possible. And probably a less therapeutic measure, they were bled. So they became weaker and weaker as time went on. So Keats shipped off to Italy and arrived in the port of Naples just in time for the ship to be quarantined by the Italian authorities for 10 days. There had been an outbreak of cholera in London, and of course the Italians did not want to have anything to do with introducing that disease to their country. So he was quarantined for 10 days, growing weaker and weaker as time went on. Eventually he got to Rome and lived only a few months before dying, as I say, at the age of 25. In any case, my wife and I went to see the room, to look at the death mask, which was made posthumously, and also to visit the cemetery, called the Protestant cemetery, as distinct from all the other cemeteries in Rome, which were, of course, Catholic. So the Protestant cemetery is where he is still buried today. Not long before his death, Keats wrote a letter to his brother George, which I'd like to read a selection from, because it sets the tone for a number of the readings I'll be doing this evening. So this is a letter dated April 21st, 1819, to his brother George. Keats says, "The common cognomen of this world is a vale of tears, from which we are to be redeemed by a certain arbitrary interposition of God and taken to heaven. What a little circumscribed notion. Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making. Then you will find out the use of the world. I say soul making, soul as distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligences or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities, till each one is personally itself. Intelligences are atoms of perception. They know and they see, and they are pure. In short, they are God. How then are souls to be made? How then are these sparks, which are God, to have identity given them? How, but by the medium of a world like this? And then he goes on in the next paragraph to define the world as, and here I quote again, a place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. So for Keats, the important Trinity, it's a very non-traditional Trinity, of course, theologically speaking. The Trinity is mind, heart, and world. So the world is the veil of soul making. It's where pure intelligence is turned through the action of the heart and the interaction with the material world into identity, into a soul. So that's how he can define the world as a veil of soul making, a valley where soul making takes place. So that's really, in a way, what all artists are trying to do, artists and writers, is to show how that creation of identity happens through the interaction with the material world, through intelligence, through the heart, through that Trinity coming together. These days, Keats's words and even his life seem almost prophetic, given the kind of pandemic that we live in these days and the way that we have to live in our peculiar veil of soul making these days. And I think it isn't just the pandemic that we're trying to live with and make our souls in, but there are other things, political divisions, as epitomized by January 6th, recently memorialized. Also by the awareness that climate change is moving faster than we ever anticipated. So we have the pandemic to deal with, we have political divisiveness and partisanship, and then we also have the climate change. So like many poets, many writers, I've written at one time or another over the last almost 2 years now about all of those aspects of our veil of soul making in 2021 and 2022. But more recently, the one that I've spent some time writing about is the threat of climate change and how that has affected our veil and affected the way we make our souls within that veil or that valley. So each of us must respond in his own way. I respond by writing. And the first poem I'm going to read is one based on a project which might seem a little incredible, but it actually is happening. In fact, it's supposed to be almost finished by this month or next month. It's the making of a black box for Earth. So this would be our flight recorder, so that if we as a race, as we as a species don't survive, that there might be others who come to this planet and need to know what happened, you know, to look at the wreck and say, okay, where did they go wrong? Maybe we can learn from them. So the title of the poem is Message Found in Earth's Black Box. And the epigraph to the poem is from a man by the name of Jim Curtis of an Australian advertising agency that actually initiated the Black Box Project. So, you know, it began as a sort of PR campaign, but it attracted very serious epidemiologists and linguists and scientists, of course, all trying to figure out what sort of message you would leave, what kind of data you would leave in a box for a species that may not know language at all, certainly not the language that we speak. And this is what he says. If our civilization does crash, this box will survive with a completely objective data story. Okay, so here is the message. You may wonder, whoever you are, why you found only this brief note and a dictionary in a steel box as big as a school bus. For school bus and dictionary, see the dictionary. Ditto for other words in this message. We planned, when we conceived this project, to fill the box with data documenting our impact on the planet's climate, how especially during the epoch we called the Anthropocene, we made our home uninhabitable. Some of us hoped Earth would survive us, that if another species like ours evolved, it would be smart enough to learn from our mistakes. Toward the end, we realized our data was beside the point, that the sources of our failure could be distilled into a sentence or two. We loved our precious little selves too much, loved other life and all that sustained it too little. We spent freely on power and pleasure, leaving the bills for our children to pay. We buried those causes like nuclear waste, out of sight, out of mind, until it was too late to reverse their effects. We destroyed the data. Please recycle this empty box, or let it stand as a monument to our monumental folly. Okay, the second poem is much closer to home. In fact, it has as some of its characters the people who are tuning in this evening, including our granddaughter, Zoe. And it's called Fire Season. And this is an aspect of climate change that is very relevant to people living in the Sonoma Valley in California, because it has to do with drought, with the threat of wildfire, and also with trying to live and make a living and go to school in a time of disease and pandemic, and trying to shelter from those aspects of our current valley of soul making. So this is called Fire Season. I promise you it has a sort of upbeat ending, though it has more staggering stops along the way. Our granddaughter's face looms larger as she leans into her computer screen, 2,000 miles away. Summer heat still lingers in Sonoma, plumping grapes and keeping people close to air conditioners. We sit close to our wood stove in Michigan, ready to light the first fire of October. Zoe joins us by laptop placed on a stool between us. She watches the flames leap from newspaper to cedar kindling, then caress the smaller splits of maple. We watch the fire reflected in her eyes, not our fire only, but fire as children know it where she lives, the word whispered or spelled out between parents packing a suitcase for evacuation. Those days, the sun glows like an ember in ashen sky. What brings up the blood in Zoe's face? Is she relieved to see nightmare contained in cast iron? Her rapture rekindles ours. Outside, The first hard frost whitens our world, spreading like wildfire. Indoors, we inhale the spice of cedar. We bask, all three of us, in the saved up radiance of summer. I appreciate the fact that Marty read a selection from the first, not just poem, but actually a whole section of my poetry collection entitled Stand Still in the Light, 46 Degrees North, because that whole section, which introduces the collection, is really devoted to creating and evoking a sense of place, the place where we all live, and the place where it's our heart and mind that interacts with our environment in such a way as to produce art, writing, and of course, our souls, our identities. If one were to name a single object in Marquette that is most associated with the city, inevitably, I think it would be our Ordock at the foot of Spring Street. And the next poem I'm going to read tells a dark story from a past chapter of the Ordock. Some of you know that right now the future looks bright for some kind of possibly environmental studies center. It's being used for lots of things, including these very nights when it gets dark. It's being used as a screen for a laser light show night after night with different objects. So all of that is very upbeat. So this goes back a ways to the 1980s. And it's a somewhat challenging poem to listen to because it's in two parts, and the two parts are out of chronological order. The first part is in October, it's set in October of 1988. And then the second part, which I'll signal when we get to it, is a flashback over 2 years to April of 1986. So that'll make your head spin. The title of the poem is Skeleton Found in Ordock 6. October 19th, 1986. Excuse me, I got it wrong. October 19th, 1988. Halfway down chute 18, it hangs like a cocoon, waiting for spring to trigger the transformation plotted in the larval DNA. But this is fall, and the raveled chrysalis of parka, jeans, and tennis shoes, derelict as the dock itself, holds only bones. 2 summers have cooked the juices off, 2 winters have freeze-dried the skin and meat. Empty sockets stare unbelieving upward at the catwalk that gave his feet the slip. Today, 2 boys, intrepid as he was, but more sure-footed, will find a missing person before he's even missed. He'll be a 1-week wonder in the news, delivered nameless and stillborn from number 6's rusty loins. Okay, now we turn the clock back 2+ years, and we find a young man stepping from the Jansen House Hotel onto Spring Street. When he stepped from the hotel porch onto Spring Street, he left it all behind. The months in foster care, the miles of pointless wandering between Mount Clemens and Marquette. Left or right? The rising sun drew him toward the lake, for it was spring despite the soiled rags of snow. He could feel the randy buzz of new beginning in his bones. Today he would slough Tim Elaine off, lose that loser's wasted years, all 17. Ahead, colossal legs and hips rose from the water, inviting him to mount and enter, daring him to be reborn. Okay, another place much closer to home. In fact, if I if I didn't have the backdrop already selected and could turn my computer screen slightly to the right, you would see that we have some lights wrapped around our deck rail. So appropriately, this poem is entitled, "Since You Asked About Our Deck Lights." We're not the kind of people who cling to Christmas trees until Valentine's Day or, God forbid, St. Patrick's. The tinsel, the ornaments, the angel whose halo grazes the ceiling, those we're ready to shed before our balsam sheds its needles. Yet we are loath to lose its nimbus of light. Stripping the tree of bulbs one year, we couldn't bring ourselves to pack away the string outside our window, entwining the deck rail like ivy. Each fall since then, weeks before the solstice, we've wrapped the rail with light. It's our defense against the dark on moonless nights, not the city kind, relieved by street lamps and neighborly windows, but the black obliteration that stalks our country homes in winter. On waking, we flick a switch and watch the thing jump back a good 10 feet. We do the same when it creeps back at twilight. We snuff the bulbs earlier each morning and light them later each evening, until one day in March they stay unlit. That's when we dismantle our perimeter, coiling the cord like concertina wire. Christmas promises so much it can't deliver. We do our little bit to help, making in the darkness an outpost of light. By way of a footnote, I should say that actually this Christmas delivered quite a bit. The line Christmas promises so much it can't deliver, but we did enjoy a very promising and also very delivering Christmas in Sonoma this year with our daughter and fiance, Doug Miller, and our son, daughter-in-law, and Zoe, who are our host and hostesses. Okay, moving on with our backyard, we've got the string of lights around the railing, but we also heat the house, as I indicated in the poem Fire Season, partly with firewood, and so we have stacks of firewood in the yard. And this poem is entitled Translation, and it's appropriately divided into 4 stanzas, each with 4 lines. So there is a kind of parallel between the form of the poem and what it describes. So it's called Translation. 4 stanzas of firewood stand in our backyard. Half cords bracketed by cribs of crisscrossed logs. Between those end stops, the rounds and slits speak a common language, maple, audible on windless days. This is what they say. Once we were a living body, basking in the solar fire, our leaves articulate as tongues. Now we are only bones, moldering and all but mute. Speak for us, set us aflame, and we will keep you warm. Okay, another backyard poem. This one I actually have a photograph of. We can look out our kitchen window and see a bird feeder. And one day looking out, I saw not only a bird feeder, but a sharp-shinned hawk and its victim that had been feasting on our bird feeder just a moment before. And so this poem is called Transmigration, And that very abstract word simply means the passage of the soul from one form of life to another. So you have to move from one species to another in order to transmigrate. And so that is what is happening in this poem. To the jay, it must have seemed as though a thunderbolt had struck it from its perch. It lay in the snow beneath the feeder, stunned, after the other birds had disappeared. So many eyes, yet none had seen the dark comet coming through the balsams. The chosen one resisted briefly as the sharp shin's talons probed its breast and throat. Then it relaxed, its black eyes focused on the distance like a martyr or jihadist contemplating paradise. It hardly felt the beak that rummaged through its down and ripped its belly open. Shifting its grip, the hawk hauled out the smoking viscera, tugging as a robin tugs at earthworms. It dipped repeatedly for meat, for heat, for fluid in a frozen world. Bit by bit, one life became another. What lifted off and flew away was neither hawk nor jay, but both, a mythic bird. A plaque of feathers marks the place of rapture, sky blue with dabs of black and white. I think it's time for some comic relief. We've had a lot of sadness and death in our Veil of Soul making, so I think I should remind you, if you need reminding, that humorous things happen, funny things happen, pleasurable things also happen in this Veil of Soul making. Someone once said that comedy is a story that heads toward tragedy and veers off at the last moment. And this would fit that definition of comedy. It's based on a true event, which took place in April of 2015. And the backstory is that two sisters came from out of state to visit a third sister in Ishpeming, and then decided that on their way back to Mackinac City, that was where they were returning their car, they would take a detour and see Tequamanon Falls. Well, they got lost and headed up a 2-track. Sounds like something I've done when I follow my Garmin sometimes, is end up on a cow path instead of on a highway. Anyway, they headed up the 2-track and got deeper and deeper into the snow, persevered, and eventually got completely stuck. So that's where the story begins. The sisters were sure it was a bear emerging hungry from its den in April. It must have smelled the Girl Scout cookies and cheese puffs. They locked the doors of their Ford Explorer and tried to sleep. At daybreak on day 13, the landscape still looked nothing like the places they called home, Nebraska and Oklahoma. Deep woods and deeper snow, an unplowed 2-track to nowhere. But it was all nowhere, wasn't it, in this part of Michigan? Thank God for their Bible, the cheese puffs, and those 8 boxes of cookies. New this year were Toffee-tastic and rah-rah raisins. Holding their breakfast ration like communion wafers, they gave thanks and chewed them slowly, savoring the sugar. Maybe next year, the GSA would issue cookies in their honor. Call them, what? Leslie Lee's? Lee and Leslie, assuming they survived, would extol their virtue in the field, claim they were the peer of Army MREs and NASA food pouches. Not that they had ever tasted either. Just then, they heard a distant roar. The bear was back, or so they thought, until a chopper cleared the treetops. Well, it was about time. They stepped out to wave like those people in the TV news, stranded on their roof when the levee failed. Now they would have to explain how they missed the turn to Mackinac City, which got them both to thinking. Instead of Leslie Lee's, how about Mackinac runes? Lately, I've been experimenting, meaning the last year while on lockdown, I've been experimenting with shorter poetic forms, including haiku. And they have one advantage, which is that you can compose them while walking. And I've been doing a lot of walking since we haven't had much else to do. So as I'm walking along, I'll be also spinning out haiku. And I use pretty much the classic familiar form, which is 17 syllables divided into a first line of 5 syllables, a second line of 7 syllables, and a third line of 5 syllables. The one little variation I do with the haiku, usually the haiku focus on very strong visual images. And so what I'm doing is trying to focus on sounds rather than images. And I've gathered them into a haiku sequence for each of the 4 seasons, and I'm going to read the one for winter. So it's 7 haiku. They're in more or less chronological order, although they're more of a collage really than a sequence. So I'll pause between each one. Rain freezes on trees, turning branches to wind chimes that click and rattle. Flushed from roadside feast by passing cars, ravens croak their disappointment. Skis whisper and glide, shushing the angry hornet drone of snowmobiles. Ice covers the creek, changing its pitch and timbre, but not its tempo. Frost cracks its bullwhip in the woods, splitting the skin of smooth-barked maples. You can tell it's cold when snow squeaks underfoot like an old farmhouse floor. Ice is booming on the lake tonight, a drum roll for the northern lights. Okay, enough winter. We do actually have other seasons in the UP, and to give you some hope, I'm going to read one that offers a transition to spring, and it's called Thaw, T-H-A-W. And there are a number of neighborhood references in the poem. Thaw. Hearing trickles turn into torrents, we know the bluff behind our house is letting go of winter, flushing it down a dozen gullies into Lake Superior. A neighbor's woods appears to be on life support. Plastic tubing links his maples to a clearing where a fire burns beneath evaporator pans. Our lives, too, could use support, a little sweetness after months of bitter. Why not connect those drip lines directly to our veins and save the firewood? Last week, my brother showed me the blisters on his palms, all he had to show for shoveling crushed stone onto 50 yards of liquid clay. The frost is unimpressed by his exertions. It keeps welling up, turning his driveway into a truck trap. You and I have the luxury of nowhere in particular to go. Thaw, we say, drawing out the vowel as the sun draws vapor from the crusty remnants of snow in our backyard. We linger over coffee after supper, savoring the afterglow. Your hands lie relaxed and open on the table, as though to gather in what's left of daylight. One of the pleasures of spring in the Upper Peninsula is the return of the fishing season. And my next poem is about trolling for lake trout on Lake Superior. Over the years, my fishing partner and I have twice witnessed the phenomenon that's described in the poem. It's rather rare. You have to have just the right conditions of insect hatch and windlessness and everything else coming together. The poem is entitled "To a Tiny Flycatcher." You found us in the fog offshore, trolling for lake trout, our boat slowly unzipping the silky surface. You arrived as though expected, as though our party was incomplete without you. You troll in your own way, flying sorties into the haze of insects that hover just above the water. We hold our breath when your wings beat against the lake like a moth at the window. Will it suck you under this time? It never does. You return to your roost on a rod tip, shake out your raincoat, and bob to the pulse of the trolling spoon. Suppose that rod were suddenly to register the violence of unseen life. Would it whip you forever from our sphere? We'll find out if a lake trout strikes. We are blessed for now to have you as companion and figurehead, the visible genius of a vast invisibility. Okay, coming into the home stretch here, I have a poem which is actually about a person, our place where we mind and heart work on the material of our environment, includes the people around us. And in this case, it is a friend and neighbor, Chuck Ganzert, who was instrumental for many years in organizing the Hiawatha Traditional Music Festival. Chuck suffered a brain hemorrhage while attending a concert, attending a conference in Seattle. So that is the tragedy behind the poem. But it's upbeat in the sense that it celebrates a well-lived life. Crossing the waters. What a story you told me, Chuck, about the summer you traveled to Tennessee for the Down Home Pick and Parlor Festival. The Red Clay Ramblers, the Highwood String Band, Robin and Linda Williams, the hottest acts in old-time music together during the hottest days of '76. Your gang of cloggers from Virginia walloped the wooden stage for an hour, sweated through the applause, then retired to a tiny creek out back. Head to foot you lay in those cooling waters, your shoes beside you on the bank. You were every inch the stellar lineup promised by the posters. An amusing sight, you called it, a memory that stuck with you. As you lay last week in your hotel room, stretched out unconscious on the floor, I like to think your bleeding brain replayed that scene from 40 years ago. You were with them again, the Hoorah Cloggers, humming the tune to Step It Out Nancy in that refreshing little Jordan of a creek. Okay, I'm going to do one more reading and then see if you folks have any questions or comments, or if either Marty or his beetle, Roberta Brown, chases me off the stage. So this is actually from the last of 3 books that I published, a work of nonfiction before turning to poetry. And is the coda, the ending to a kind of combination memoir, history, and natural history of a valley in southeastern Wisconsin, the Bark River Valley. And the passages from a book entitled The Bark River Chronicles, Stories from a Wisconsin Watershed. And at this moment in the story, Puck and I, my fellow paddler, have reached our destination. We've paddled the entire length of the river from the headwaters down to the Rock River, actually, where Lorene Nideker, a well-known internationally Wisconsin poet, had her kind of a shack where she did her writing and lived much of her life, and about which she wrote many poems. So this conclusion finds me, I guess, reflecting on my own soul making as we are paddling into shore at the end of our voyage. Something about the scene, its lucid tranquility perhaps, reminds me of an experience I've had before. Till then, I'd been skeptical when people told me about moments of sudden illumination, transient states in which everything seemed as simple and transparent as crystal. So I was more embarrassed than uplifted when I had such a visitation myself. One moment I was walking along, thinking of nothing in particular. The next moment I just knew what my final conscious thoughts would be. My life will not flash before my eyes like a video in manic fast forward, nor will a figure in white greet me on the threshold of a mysteriously lighted chamber. There will be no Hollywood stagecraft whatsoever. Instead, I will be enveloped, bathed in a swarming amorphous cloud of sensations and images. Some I will recognize abstractly as pleasant, others as painful. But I will feel neither pleasure nor pain. None of my accomplishments, modest as they are, will matter. Whatever good I have done will elicit no pride, the evil no regret. The cloud will consist mostly of faces and places. Among the faces will be those of the people closest to me, Puck, my children, my parents, my sister and brother, longtime friends. The places will include spectacular landscapes viewed just once or twice, glaciers in Alaska, mountaintops in Tibet and China, vineyards in Italy, rolling green pastures in England, sand dunes in Morocco, ancient ruins in Mexico, cloud forests in Costa Rica, walled cities in Spain, coastal estuaries in Portugal. Conspicuous in the cloud, surging to the fore and fading away, then surging back again, will be the places that I have known in all seasons, in all kinds of weather, in all hours of the day. Among these, winding sinuously through my last mortal moment, like a silver thread in a tapestry, will surely be the Bark River. Okay, so that's the making of my soul in the valley of the Bark River. So thank you for your patience in listening through all of these pieces. Marty, do you want to take over as MC or?
Yeah, I just invite people if anybody has a comment or question for Milt, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and ask a question if you'd like. It looks like your daughter says that was great. Thank you for sharing your craft. There you go. And Roberta says, you mean I'm supposed to give you the hook? Oh, okay. Roberta has a question for you.
Yes. So Milton, who would you say are your tutelary spirits? In other words, the poets that have influenced your writing the most?
My first book was a biography of Wallace Stevens, and I would say he was very influential. but more as a spirit than as a writing coach. I think if you looked at his work next to mine, it would be night and day. You wouldn't recognize that there was any influence of Stephen's upon my own writing. But I think immersing myself in his work, in his world, and his letters over the years did make a difference. And it, I think, made me understand the possibilities of writing, not so much how to do it or what I should imitate, or, because interestingly, he left behind a notebook, which I edited, in which he simply recorded titles of poems he would like to write. And they're really zany titles. One is, for example, Still Life with Aspirin. Okay, where do you go with that? Well, I wrote down I had all of those, of course, written down as I was doing the editing. And I decided at one point that I would try to write the poems to go with the titles that he had written. And after writing a half a dozen, I realized it was a fool's errand. I simply did not, I was not on his wavelength when it came to his method of writing. Yet he does continue to influence me. In fact, the current issue of the Wallace Stevens Journal has a poem by me entitled A Pretext for Poetry. And it's where he imagines, well, he doesn't have to imagine it. He actually records waking up late at night after some snow had melted and refrozen on his lawn. And he had his window slightly open, and he could hear the cat stepping onto the crystals of ice as it walked across the yard. And he said, that's the kind of moment that the imagination seizes as a pretext for poetry. So my own poem is a very different kind of poem, but is about that kind of moment, that moment of call it inspiration, call it the interaction between mind and world in the veil of soul making, whatever you want to call it. Stevens was very good at articulating that process of imagination, but a very different and, of course, much better poet. So he would be important when it comes to a poet who I see almost as a kindred spirit, somebody who writes very much the kind of work I would like to write. I would say Ted Kooser. But there are others. When I was going through this period of writing very short pieces, I was also reading Kay Ryan, who writes very short pieces that are just wonderful. Again, she does it better than I do, because I'm the student sort of trying to imitate the master, in this case mistress, but she can be an inspiration. And I think I find other models along the way. Someone I'll read for a while and say, I wonder if I could do that. And I give it a try. But I think the one that I come back to the most often is Ted Kooser.
Janine has a question for you. She says, Milt, have you tried other forms beside haiku recently?
I think my default mode is to write lines that are either 10 or 8 syllables long. So it ends up being blank verse or a sort of truncated blank verse. But when I do other forms, I'll do different stanza forms, but there's actually a couple of the really short poems have only 6 syllables in them. And they might go on fairly long, but that can be a very tight form within which to work to keep consistently coming back to. I could give you an example of that, but I'll save it for an open mic in one of our future get-togethers of the Marquette Poet Circle, where it is 6 syllables to a line. So I'm constantly experimenting with. I use syllable count not as sort of a fetish, but as sometimes you need something to challenge you to think harder about what you want to put down. You don't want the form to decide what you want to say, but you want the form to provoke ideas that maybe you wouldn't have come up with unless you had some demanding form to work within. So, but the answer lately is not much. Haiku has been about it.
All right. Kathleen has a comment. She says, listening tonight without text to follow, I was struck by your strong sense of meter, a dancing movement moving through the poems, iambic mostly, ? And she says she loves that.
Oh, I'm glad I was able to oblige. It's totally unconscious, though I will constantly fiddle with word arrangement and syntax of sentences till I get something that sounds right, but I couldn't tell you necessarily why it sounds right. It's just, the ear trying to pick it up.
And Melina said, I noted that same sense of intentionality around the cadence and tone, super impactful as a listener without text.
Oh, I should listen to myself sometimes. I have something to learn.
Well, we'll post this video and you can watch the whole thing over if you want.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. How long do we have to wait for this?
It'll be up tomorrow. So yeah, you could listen to it tomorrow. So.
Okay, well, I start drinking the coffee at 6 a.m. So I hope it's up by then.
Oh, okay. I'll make sure it is. Does anybody have any other comments or questions for Milt tonight? Oh, my wife who's sitting behind me has a question.
I just actually have some comments about my favorite images, Milt.
Mhm.
I really liked when you talked about the martyr and the jihadist contemplating paradise. That was a really nice image for me. I really liked the Mackinac poem. Thank you for including some brevity in here, because
Levity.
levity, sorry, brevity and levity, I guess.
Yeah.
And then
I'm working on brevity, the levity completely.
Well, thank you for the levity as well. I like the drum roll of the Northern Lights. I thought that was just it's a beautiful way that you put it. And I like when you talked about unzipping the silky surface of the water.
Yeah,
Unzipping the silky surface of the water. I'm not really a fishing enthusiast, but that just hit me just in the right way. So thank you very much for reading tonight. Thank you for your brevity and your levity.
And thank you for your comments.
Yes, sir.
All right. Does anybody have any final questions or comments for Milt? All right. Zoe says, I really like the poems, Grandpa. There you go. I think that's the greatest compliment that you can get, Milt.
Gee, I'll live into the next generation, the next two
there
generations.
You go.
Yeah, she's been the subject of a couple of poems, so she's she has an investment in this.
Well, there you go. There you go. Well, I really want to thank you, Milt, for being Mr. January for me. A couple things. The next couple months, authors reading virtually. Next in February, we have B.G. Bradley, who's going to be joining us again because he's releasing another book. I don't know how he does this. I think he just released one in like November or December, and he's got another one coming out in February. And then in March, we have Dennis Henriksen, who's going to be coming back. He just released a new book of poems. So he's going to be joining us reading from his new book of poems. So I'm really excited about that. But this has been really, really wonderful. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. And do realize that all of the in-person adult programming has been suspended or changed to virtual programming, at least until the end of this month. And we figure out how things are going with COVID. But there is some really good virtual programming coming up next Tuesday for Martin Luther King Day. There is going to be a filmmaker named Craig Dudnick who made a film called Alice's Lonely Voices, I think that is, about a really central figure in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. So we're going to be doing that program starting at 6 p.m. virtually on Tuesday. So something to celebrate the work of Dr. King with that week. So, anyway, thank you again, Milt, for doing this for me. And
My pleasure.
we'll work on the calendar, you know, and get some good pictures, and maybe we'll have a Marquette Poet Circle calendar next year. So who knows?
Marty,
Yes.
Marty, I need to speak.
Yes.
You know, Janine gave us a video about a year ago, and I forget the name. Janine, maybe you remember, the Calendar Girls.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I think if you got that video, this could be a very entertaining calendar.
I've seen that movie. I'm
All
not
right,
sure if I
good.
really participate in a project like that, though. I really am not. So anyway, it's a great film, though. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and stay warm out there. It almost felt balmy this morning when I woke up. It was like 20 degrees out. So, you know, and there he is. Look at it. There he is. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful night. And hopefully we'll see you on some virtual programs this month. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great job, Dad. I loved it. Thank you.
Loved it. Good job.
What was that you were saying?
We've made